So our next speaker is Dr. Wanning, who is Professor of Media and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Technology, Sydney. She also serves as the Deputy Director of the UTS Australia-China Relations Institute. She's a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Is best known in the field of China studies for ethnography of rural to urban migration and social inequality in contemporary China. A columnist for Crikey, she currently writes about Chinese Australian communities, media representation of China and Australia-China relations, and the impact of the AUKUS announcement on the Chinese Australian community. So, over to you, Greta.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's not every day they get to come to a conference that actually starts with singing songs. I have been to academic conferences for the last 25 years, and this is the first time that the conference starts with a song, which I think it's just so fresh and delightful. And also, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal land on which I stand and live and work. I just work at UTS, which is literally across the road. And and my head is an academic, so I hope that you don't find me too pedantic. I try my best. I would like to speak to two questions today. The first question is, how come the Australian government managed to get this far with AUKUS without fearing a public backlash? The second question I'd like to speak to is, what does all this mean for Australia's Chinese communities? And if I have time, then I'll go on to the third question, which is, what does AUKUS say about what kind of country we're now living in? But if I don't have time, and then I'll leave the questions to you. So the first one, how come that the Australian government manages to shove AUKUS down our throat, really, without fear of a backlash? And I think Sue has already mentioned that because enough fear has been created, right? So that in order to sell AUKUS, there needs to be a sense of anxiety and fear. And there needs to be the manufacture of a sense of threat, right? So the creation of fear and the manufacturing of threat. And you ask, how is this possible? How is this created? How is it manufactured? And putting on the hat of the academic, as a media academic, I would say that there are a few processes in play. The first process is what I call the formation of a coalition of securitizers. Okay, so it doesn't just take one to actually say we have a threat. It takes a whole range of stakeholders and people from the society. First of all, it takes the government, and then it takes the political elites, and then it takes the security agencies such as Defense and ASIO and so on and so forth. And then you've got the media, right? So this, we call them coalitions of securitizers because they work somehow together, sometimes willingly, sometimes unwittingly, to actually promote this sense of fear and threat. And so much so that since you probably remember from 2017, the particular Four Corners episode of Power and Influences, where the Chinese influences narrative, there was a program, there was co-production between Fairfax and ABC. There was a lot of problem with that program, and two defamations actually against the media, and that program was not even available to show because it's legally, doesn't have a leg to stand on. But nevertheless, that program was instrumental in giving permission to the media to report about Australian-China relationship in a particular kind of way. Now, once upon a time, China is Australia's biggest trading partner. So there's always this sense of threat because of the different political system. So on one hand, you've got China as an opportunity, because as Hugh White said, China makes us rich US makes it safe, right? So on one hand, you've got the biggest trading partner is China as an opportunity. On the other hand, you see China as the biggest threat. So you've got this parallel kind of narratives going on for a decade or so. And then, but starting from 2016 to 2017, you see the kind of China as an opportunity narrative submerged under the China threat narrative. In other words, we only have a China threat narrative. And China's opportunity narrative is still there, but now we assume that China is still our biggest trading partner, and we're even more under threat precisely because we're so dependent on China, right? So as a result of that, you have this, the what I call coalition of securitizers. And parallel to that, or another way of saying this is that we are actually moving closer and closer to what we see during the Cold War era. AUKUS, for AUKUS to succeed, you have to have the formation of what we call military, industrial, government, academia, and the media complex. They all need to work together. Scientists need to come in, the media needs to come in, and the government in the industry needs to come in, and the military need to come in, and the government come in. And so when this all comes together without, so you now have the hallmark of the Cold War, right? So if you read the Cold War literature, this kind of complex, industrial, military, academia, and media complex is what needs to happen. The next one is what I call the return of the Cold War journalism, right? And you will say, what is Cold War journalism? How is it different from with normal sort of public interest journalism? Well, let me just read out a couple of definitions that's sort of standard media studies kind of text. First of all, Cold War journalism assumes the unseen dimension of war, even though that war may be invisible or imagined. Okay? Does that sound familiar? The second one is that Cold War journalism adopts a particular view of the geopolitical reality that relies on accepting certain strategic notions of who is our enemy, right? So the third one is Cold War journalism reinforces certain understandings of who is us, that is the free world, us and the US and Five Eyes and smokers and all that, and who is them, the authoritarians, terrorists, the communists, and so on and so forth. So, the Four Corners programs, the 60 Minutes sort of prediction of war is going to come in 3 years or 5 years or whatever. Sydney Morning Herald's Peter Hodges, Red Alert, regular stories that frame Australian-China relationship exclusively in terms of China threat and China. So as a result of that, our public has become sufficiently primed. And it's just like a frog that's just being slowly being boiled and without realizing what's happening. That now it has become just the norm, the new norm. My institute, which is AUKUS, Australian China Relations Institute, every year does a poll of the Australians, of the sentiment in relation to China. And this year's poll came out 2 months ago. Again, we asked this question. Do you think that Australia needs to increase its military spending in order to deal with the China threat? 64% say yes. 64% say yes. And then when they were asked, do you think AUKUS will actually make Australia safe against the China threat? As many as 48% said yes. That's almost half. That's almost half. And we do that every year, and the numbers stay more or less the same. The percentage stay more or less the same. So, so that is really a kind of concerning, if you like. The next one I want to talk about is what does all this mean for the Chinese community? Now, the Chinese communities, of course, logically, are much more sensitive to what is being covered in the news about China, about Australian-China relationships, and about themselves. Understandably so, because they're, this is where they come from, this is who they are, this is their identity. They also have this acute kind of sort of feeling that if China and somehow is at war with Australia, they are the first to suffer, right? So I myself have done some survey, of 800 people, and then in-depth interviews 20 people, and I've done some focus group to ask them, how do you react to Australia's media's China threat narrative? And I find that there is a much higher level of concern about the war and the speculations about the war. And overwhelmingly large majority, there's 91% told me they are extremely concerned, either extremely concerned or quite concerned about what might happen to them in the event of a war. So in other words, they're very, very anxious when they read this news. Another story is about, from Sydney Morning Herald, from Peter Hajur or whatever, and they really worried them because for a number of reasons. One, they kind of believe that somehow, rightly or wrongly, they believe that the more you talk about war, the more likely you will make it happen. They think there is some kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you like. And the second reason is that they believe, and this is actually proved by actual research, that all this media narrative about China threat will actually directly impact on their well-being, even though they have nothing to do with, with this and not living in China anymore. And that will translate into racism and anti-Chinese sentiment on the streets, on the buses, on the trains, and to them. And so that's another one, increase the sense of racism and discrimination. But finally, and this sounds like sensational to say, but quite a few people say, we have heard that during the Second World War, if the war breaks out, the migrants from that country, from the enemy country, were interned. Yeah, this happened to the Italians and it happened to the Germans. Who is going to tell us that it won't happen to us? And nobody can give them a guarantee, right? Because they know that if the war is here, all bets are off, right? So they really have this kind of fear in a way that is much more visceral than I would say the people who are, most members of Australian public who just read another story over their breakfast cereal and say, just another story, and put it away. But to them, it is actually really impacting on their mental health. So when I actually realized this, I did a survey of asking some questions. For instance, one of the questions I asked them is that what is your dominant emotional response when you read this kind of media? 60% of respondents, the cohort is about 700 people, 63% tell me the most dominant feeling that came to them is helpless. There's nothing they can do. They don't have a voice. And then another 35%, there's 30, and they can do that, you can click more than one. 35% said that they feel angry. And the 25% felt baffled. Why? What's going on? Why all this hostility? And 20% said they just feel just plain sad, really sad. It's come to this. So I guess they were very clear to me. The two messages they gave me is very clear. One is they no longer believe in the professionalism of our media in their reporting of China. Even though, interestingly, they tell me they trust the state Chinese media even less. Okay? They say that they still place great credibility and value in Australian media's coverage of domestic issues. But they very firmly believe in the coverage of China, Australian media have got it really, really wrong. So, and then I asked them, and I said, who do you think is the best person to judge the accuracy of media coverage of China? Is this the Australian people who have no experience with China, or the Chinese people who live in China, or people like you? And they said, people like us. And I said, is that a bit grandiose? No, it's not, because I read the Chinese propaganda, and I read this, and I don't believe any of this. I triangulate, I form my own opinion. Right. So and I thought, okay, that does make sense. And then some are very, very acutely aware of the fact they've been sort of imagined as being brainwashed by Chinese propaganda. And then they actually say it is them that's being brainwashed, but they don't even know they are being brainwashed. So there's lots going on there. So I think in terms of the, I think the Australian Chinese community, of course, is a complex community and it's diverse and it's people from different kind of demographics and migration history and so on and so forth. And I think the one that's most hard hit is the first generation PRC migrants, because they have close connection with China and they're the one that's most subject to suspicion and accusation of disloyalty, right? And you regularly get stories from the Australian newspapers. I'll just pick one out of my brain. Like a few earlier, towards the end of last year, you've got Daily Mail ran a story about an aviation show somewhere in Avalon in Melbourne, and everybody can go. It's a public event, and some Chinese-looking people went there with nice cameras and took pictures, and then suddenly people said, they're Chinese. They have really nice cameras. They're taking pictures of the aviation shows. They must be spies. So, and without any evidence, and there is a story like that came out. So, I'd like to quote Osman Chu. You probably have heard of Osman Chu. He's one of the three who got interrogated by Eric Abetz, and they were demanded by Eric Abetz to pledge their loyalty to Australia and denounce Communist Party. And so he said, the fear that he was referring to the Chinese community, the fear arises of the perceived risk of being the target of distrust and exclusion, all seen as a potential vector of foreign influence simply due to their cultural background or family ties. It also fuels the perception that the Chinese Australians would be acceptable collateral damage in the conflict. It's basically, yes, we just have to sacrifice a small group of percentage of people for the international interest, that kind of discourse. So that is pretty much what I want to say in these two questions. I don't know whether I have time. No. So I think I will leave it there. I'm happy to talk more.